Good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here in this distinguished lecture series organized by the Lloyd's Register Foundation ICoN program. As we're getting on and having a bit of a little tradition, we inaugurated this lecture series last year with Hayatum Salem, the CEO of Royal Academy of Engineering, kicking off, and this year we've had the pleasure of having Shaun Fitzgerald, who's the director of the Royal Institution, and we couldn't think of anyone better to talk to us about public awareness and the need of public awareness for science and engineering. So without any further ado, thank you so much again, Shaun, for being here with us today. We very much look forward to your talk.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here representing the Royal Institution as part of this esteemed lecture series. I thought we would share this evening the role of and the importance of public engagement with science. And on the screen behind me, the title is intended to be just a little provocative. We need to talk. Now those languages, those words are ones which we might refer to our children, for example, when something's not quite working. We need to talk. Now, clearly, there's a double entendre here, because what we're really saying is that in the world of science, we need to talk about actually science, because the modern society, what is it that really separates us from thousands of years ago? And it is the evolution of technology and our use of technology and our adoption of it, maybe the adoption and then use. And all of that is really rather important in terms of thinking about how you actually make a difference to society using science. Because science on its own will make not one jot of a difference to the world. It will only make a difference to the world if it is embraced, and if it is then used by society at large. And it is not obvious, and it's actually not always the case, that just the great ideas will always get adopted. It's not as simple as that. And the slide behind me here is Faraday talking with another scientist. Now that is a form of engagement where one scientist is sort of sharing with another. And yet, that is only one form of public engagement. And public engagement works best when it is well considered, so when one is thinking about the issues that you are really wrestling with, and then well planned, well structured, and then well executed too, in terms of therefore how do you actually go and engage with your audiences, and through what channels, who the actor is important, where. There are lots of issues to consider in terms of making a success of public engagement. So one can start with maybe two scientists. So that might be you as a scientist and actually asking your colleague who's not on your project, but actually you want to go and share with them. That might be what's going on here in this picture, and actually getting their insights. Well, one could do a little bit more than that, and this is actually from the 1900s. So this is Dewar in the Royal Institution talking about liquid hydrogen, and talking about liquid hydrogen to a wider public. And you'll notice that the dress code for these sorts of meetings is perhaps not what we would be using today in terms of public engagement, and I can assure you that's not the dress code that we use in the Royal Institution for our events when we're actually wanting to engage with the wider public. One or two sometimes do still turn up in black tie, but it is a very small minority. And I personally endeavour to try and not wear a tie, for example, and things like that, because actually we're trying to reach and communicate with a wide audience. So that's one form, but we're still, in this stage here, really it's an hour-long monologue followed by some Q&A. But just think about this, that for most of the time that audience is there, they're listening and they're receiving. Is that really a form of dialogue? So it's monologue followed by dialogue. And one can then really go a little bit further. And this is an example of a citizen forum. So a citizen science cafe meeting where actually this isn't just scientists, this is the public now discussing a scientific issue. And this is what is important in terms of really getting the public involved in thinking about how science might not just be deployed, but how it might even be originated in the first place. What are the issues that we are going to be wrestling with? So those are just some examples to get us warmed up, really. Enthusiasm for science generally is believed to be growing. And if you just look at some of these statistics, this is the Ipsos Mori poll in 2014, looking at public attitudes to science. And look at these statements. More people agree it is important to know about science in my life in 2014. And that was 72% of the respondents agreed with that statement versus 57% years earlier in 1988. Similarly, more people are comfortable about the pace of change. And that was 34% agreeing in, people are comfortable at the pace of change. Science makes people's lives change too fast, So it was the negative comment there. 34% agreed in 2014, and a much larger proportion, 49%, agreed in 1988. And that's really interesting. So not only is science important, but, and if you think about our modern world and the rate at which things are happening, people are actually more comfortable now about the pace of change, which appears to be increasing, than in the past. That's really rather encouraging. So enthusiasm for science and its role in society is growing. But it isn't all plain sailing, and it's not all good news. This was some data that was issued by the Wellcome Global Monitor report last year, 2018. Only 59% of people in Western Europe agree that vaccines are safe, compared with something like 95% in South Asia. This is it's a well-known slide. It was bandied around a lot, but it's really rather alarming, really, if you think about the role of vaccines and actually how important they are for the health system, that only 59% of people in Western Europe are actually saying, yep, they're safe, and therefore the behaviours arising from that are really, really important. But that, is much lower than other parts of the world. And it's really important to ask the question as to why. What is it about it being a more accepted form, for example, in terms of they think it's safe in other parts of the world? So is it because of the actors involved in the messaging? Is it actually the words themselves? Is it a cultural context? So who's involved? What is the cultural norm? And in the West, as you'll be aware, that there is a culture where we're always encouraged to question. That's what we do with our children. We're teaching them to really question things, and that may not be quite the same as in other cultures. One's not right, one's not wrong. It's just recognizing the different contexts. But ultimately, when you've got things like this in terms of vaccines, therefore being safe, deemed to be safe or not, the challenging thing is it then affects behaviours afterwards. And there is a hypothesis that we would like to pose to you. And that is that scientific advance, and as I mentioned right at the very beginning, this is not just about the development of technology. Scientific advance of society critically includes public acceptance and therefore adoption of those technologies. The hypothesis is that it is improved by well-considered, well-structured, and well-executed public engagement. It's a hypothesis. I was asked before the lecture, I would deem this a killer question. Well, how do you know? Right? This is a hypothesis. How do you know? Where is the data that's going to suggest that you are doing things more effectively in year one versus 10 years ago, and that you're having more of an effective engagement? It's very difficult, because whatever one is doing, you're part of a whole portfolio of things, and therefore are lots of other things going on, and it's a really, really difficult question. But this is the hypothesis. And furthermore, the hypothesis is the sooner the engagement starts, the better. Now, this is important, and it also, therefore, affects the types of public engagement that you can then consider. Right? So the later you are, your options are rather more limited. The earlier you start, your options are much, much broader. So what does that mean? These are three examples. So education, dialogue, and co-production. Education. Education historically, if you think about that slide from Dewar, where we are getting the message out and out to the masses. So an education forum, which is more of a monologue. I'm not saying it's a complete monologue, but is more of a monologue where you're doing information dissemination. That's the education game. I understand that there are other forms of education. So, for example, our education systems in schools, we get children to go and work and do exercises, and they interact with themselves, they interact with the teacher. So it's not supposed to be, it's all monologue, but this is what I mean by education. And it's getting people to learn things about a particular topic. Now, dialogue. Now, dialogue is where we really are looking at a two-way communication, and that might even include things like citizens' forums. But what is the net result of a lot of dialogue? Sometimes dialogue, so scientist with public, informs the scientist, but then it just informs the scientist as to how better to communicate, and they might change how they're communicating. That is not necessarily the right answer. The right answer might be that what they're actually proposing as a scientific idea may not be the right for society. So when we look at co-production, this is where we are looking at a much deeper level of engagement, where your audience, the public, for example, are brought in early on and are helping inform the scientists as much as the scientists informing the public. Because what you thought was a great idea behind your lab bench, you've come up with this great thing. There may be some real obstacles for your audience, the citizens that you're trying to impact, as a result of their cultural context that you do not understand. If you had those conversations, then that bright idea that you may have had, you might want to put in the waste paper basket and start from scratch again as to, right, how else am I going to think about tackling this problem? Furthermore, you might actually want to go and work with the public and actually say, should we brainstorm this together? Rather than being me as the great I am, actually, yes, I've got something to contribute, and get the public on board in terms of trying to sort of think about different solutions to some of the challenges which they face. And in fact, they may even steer your research direction so that you end up tackling different problems, because now you realise that this is what the public really cares about, and that can be really exciting. So the earlier this goes on, then it can lead to very productive research, right? In other words, because the research that you're then going to end up developing in your labs and things like this are going to be the ones which are going to then get adopted by society. And as engineers, I'm an engineer, I care about science and its use in society. And if I've developed a white elephant that then doesn't get used in society, I'm not a very good engineer. So this is why this sort of stuff is incredibly important. So what does public engagement mean to the Royal Institution? Well, the Royal Institution, you saw from the slides earlier, we're not a young organisation. We've been around a while. We were founded in 1799. And there's a rather lovely sort of document that we were able to find in our archives, which actually laid out the principles of our purpose. And it reads as following. It's an institution for diffusing the knowledge and facilitating the general introduction of useful mechanical inventions and improvements, and for teaching, by courses of philosophical lectures and experiments, the application of science to the common purposes of life. Now, actually, it's very, very deep. But it isn't necessarily language that we might necessarily feel as comfortable using today in an engineering context. I confess that. Right? My linguistic skills would be that would I have written this last week in a journal paper? Probably not. Would anyone have read this in a modern journal? Probably not. Only in terms of it being referencing something from a while ago. And we were founded in 1799 at a very interesting stage of history. So we were at war with France, and that meant international trade was nigh on impossible, given the types of routes that one could easily consider at that particular point. Furthermore, we had to therefore look after ourselves, fend for ourselves, and think about actually how we're going to go and develop society. And you had some scientists in the United Kingdom, but you also had people who were then going to be able to use it. And at that time, the Royal Institution was set up and with the public lectures and things like this, with a first and foremost mission to be able to communicate with, not to, communicate with the parties who might be able to use the new scientific knowledge. So the landowners, for example, to be able to improve agriculture, the military, for thinking about how we might improve the effectiveness of our military machine whilst we're at war. And other parts of society, so the heavy industries as well, industrial revolution and things like this, you've got to think about improvements there. So the scientists involved in the Royal Institution were there, and at that point in time we were doing scientific research at the Royal Institution, but the communication with the wider public was a massively, massively important part of the remit of the Royal Institution. And it's that part that lives today, by the way. It's the communication and engaging with the public. That is the purpose of the Royal Institution. And the various scientists that we've had over the course of time at the Royal Institution are very well-known names: Davy, Faraday, Dewar, Bragg, many, many incredibly well-known scientists. But they weren't just good scientists, they were awesome communicators. It was one of the hallmarks of being able to be a scientist at the Royal Institution. And the success, therefore, of engaging with the public meant that, for example, we had Albemarle Street, where we're located in London, was the first one-way street in London, because the crowds were flocking to the lectures and it was carnage out there, so they had to go and organise the traffic on Albemarle Street, and therefore the best way of doing that was to create a one-way street, and of course one-way streets are now pervasive across the world. The Royal Institution was also very inclusive. So you didn't just have to, I know that photograph, the sketch on the earlier slides showed a lot of men in smart evening attire. They weren't just men though. Women were invited as well. And Faraday was extremely good at engaging children. So with the Christmas lectures and things like this. So science was not just for the landed gentry to go and improve their agricultural methods. No, actually public engagement, even back then, it was very, very important that you thought about the wider public, and all sections of it at that time were welcomed into the Royal Institution. Admittedly, you needed a bit of money to be able to pay for the tickets or become a member and things, but wider public engagement was incredibly important and still is today. So, what does the Royal Institution in terms of do today in terms of public engagement? We're guided by actually a vision that we have in our documentation that we have drawn from the archives, actually. So the mission and the strategy that was launched last year is actually very highly correlated with the founding documents of the Royal Institution. So our vision is a world where everyone is inspired to think more deeply about science and its place in our lives. And all of that is really important. So we don't just want people to think about science. We want people to think about science and its impact on society. So actually how it can lead to the betterment of the world. And I don't just mean our living environment. The betterment of the world could mean, for example, tackling things like climate change. In other words, it's not just your lot, it's for improving the world at large. And therefore that's its impact and its place in our lives, its impact on our lives, our impact on the world. So what do we actually do at the Royal Institution? We have three main offerings along the lines of education, dialogue and co-production. Education, although I said that was actually mainly a monologue, is actually our main offering. So if I think about, we have a big education team, I don't mean that we are just there in a monologue environment. So admittedly the Christmas lectures that we do, which are coming on the television shortly, that is where we have children in the audience, and it's an amazing engagement where we don't just tackle science, physics, chemistry in terms of dry subjects. We tackle an issue now because we believe that people are interested in issues, and then we bring the science in through the back door, as it were, to go and then explore how you might tackle some of those issues. So, for example, this year's Christmas lectures are going to be on the topic of maths, which at first glance might be rather dry. I mean, I have a PhD in applied maths, so I guess I've got a small license to be able to speak in those terms. But the role of maths in society, we all care about what happens to our data. We did care about the reports about Cambridge Analytica and things like this, and therefore what is it you're asking for? Are you asking for anonymity or privacy when it comes to your health data? And Sir John Bell, for example, made this rather lovely remark on the radio about a year ago. You can sequence the DNA of your genome very easily these days, but if you just want to do yours and keep it private, the value of that is actually very, very little, almost zero. It's only in the context of, therefore, how your information compares with the rest of the information available that we can start to learn things about you that we might be able to, therefore, help with your health. So you can't just keep it in isolation. But therefore, you've then got to wrestle with data. So that's just an example in terms of this topic of maths. But the format of the lectures is still going to be mainly actually talking to the children, bringing them into onto the stage and getting them to participate in some of the experiments and the demonstrations. But in large part, it'll still be a communication in that way. We also have science and school shows, which are an interesting way of exciting children with what we do with science. So there's a core offering of education. We have a strong offering in dialogue, and that is where, for example, with our public lectures, we have serious Q&A afterwards, and actually that's where it really gets exciting. And we also have where we have evening events which are not a lecture in the standard form. We have an evening event which is just a panel debate with a few short questions maybe from the host, and then it's open to the public, where actually they almost lead the layout of the evening, because they're asking questions on the topic of the evening of these expert panelists. And sometimes the panelists end up with discussing amongst themselves as well. We have differing opinions, and that's really informative as well. So you then have a great dialogue. Co-production, we're a supporter of that. We're not heavily involved in that at the moment, but frankly, that isn't because we don't value it. We value it hugely. It's to do with actually just limitations of resources. So we can't do everything, but that's what we do at the Royal Institution. And as I've mentioned our activities, I mentioned the science and school shows, but some of the other things that we do in our education arena, we have in our basement at the Royal Institution, the L'Oreal Young Scientist Centre. And we have thousands of children coming every year to the Royal Institution. And rather than just having a 1-hour chemistry lab lesson in their school, which they might get through once or twice a week, they spend a whole day with us. And therefore, the children are able to do much deeper learning, much deeper scientific experiments and understanding. We will do at least 2 long-form experiments with them when they're with us for the day. And it's a whole different range of ages that we're able to cater for. So that's our Young Scientist Centre. We also offer these things called masterclasses. And masterclasses for primary school and for secondary school. And they are, think of these as much deeper immersion, where many of them are on a Saturday morning. So these are children who are selected by their schools to participate in either a computer science or a maths or an engineering masterclass for 6 Saturday mornings on the trot, where it might be a local university or it might be a local company to where the children live, run these masterclasses. They're organised through the Royal Institution. We provide all of the back office support in terms of GDPR and the child protection issues and things like that, as well as helping the deliverers of the masterclass. So it might be an academic from Southampton, for example, but helping them with materials, the cultivation, development of materials relevant for that age group. And that's really important. So you might have an academic here who's used to teaching undergraduates, but when you're teaching 12-year-olds, it's a rather different ballgame. And therefore, we have experts at the Royal Institution who are able to work with these amazing academics and amazing engineers from companies and things to actually just develop the right materials. And masterclasses are a fantastic opportunity where children meet other children of similar minds. So mainly attitude, and that's what really matters. Have you got an interest in the subject? clearly it's correlated the people that are going to come on a Saturday morning with a level of ability as well, in all likelihood. But it's not necessarily the case. It's to do with, have you got an interest that we need to feed and develop? So that's really, really important. So the masterclasses have been going for decades, and they are a fantastic way, and it's nationwide, that the Royal Institution runs. Family Fun Days, they're in London, where actually families come with their children, and the building is opened up, and we have a whole range of different experiments. And what blows me away is that the kinds of activities that we lay on for each of these seems to change every time. So it's fresh. Even if you come to this, a Family Fun Day, every quarter, you're not going to get bored, because all the activities are different again, and the effort that goes into those from the Royal Institution is phenomenal. And then summer schools. So we have sort of multi-day programs over the course of the summer for children to come and develop on longer form projects throughout a holiday. The public programs are typically for a wider range of ages, so children can still clearly come, but they're also targeted at adults. And then the Friday discourses, which are now once a month, they are part of the Royal Institution history, where that was probably the people in the formal attire that you saw on the earlier slide, where we're working with presenters who are going to go and give an hour lecture, followed by 15 minutes of questions, and it's to do with the history of the format of that particular type of event. And the lady on the bottom is Roma Agrawal. She was here very recently giving a talk on the recipe for skyscrapers. So she's a phenomenal engineer working for ICoN, and was able to talk with the public about, actually, this is how you go and design the future of cities, really, but future skyscrapers. Very, very exciting. Right, who is at stake in public engagement? Everyone. It's an obvious comment, but it doesn't make it any less true. And it's really important that when we say everyone, it includes the scientists, all right, on subjects that they don't know anything about. Because you can be an expert in your particular area, but you're also a non-expert as in all of the other areas, and therefore you are a member of the public as well. So when we talk about the public, that's what we really mean. It is everybody, and all of us, are members of the public. I mean, I might know a bit more than somebody else about certain subjects, but I can assure you that I know probably less than many people who are just well read in many other areas. But it's important that we are all members of the public. So everyone should be involved on the public front. But then we also have, quote, as we move, other stakeholders. So research practitioners, such as those working in academia. So the postdocs, the PhDs. And the professors here, they're research practitioners, and non-government organisations also have researchers as well involved in those organisations developing ideas. So we've got research practitioners in that element, but we also have research practitioners in the business world, and this is huge. And they are very, very important part of the stakeholder network for public engagement. So people developing products, actually some of these organisations aren't just developing products, they're doing blue sky research, and they don't even know whether it's going to get anywhere. It's just what they think is a good idea might come from this area. And it's a different funding mechanism in a way, but also a different environment. They're very, very important. You've then got academic executives, so I'm sure we've got a few of those in the University of Southampton who are interested in thinking about the use of research and engagement of the public. But these academic executives ultimately are running a university, and part of the university's remit and success is how its scientific research, for example, and its student body is able to make a difference to the world. Funders is becoming much more mainstream now to include public engagement as part of a funding application for a research grant, in terms of this is what you're going to do as part of that research grant in terms of engaging with a particular community. And that's been also encouraged by the government and regulatory bodies. So UKRI, so one of their 6 pillars includes public engagement. It's that important. And then lastly, you've got actually other people involved just in the broad network in terms of people who are interested in public engagement. So good public engagement has far-ranging impacts. First of all, scientists like some of the people in the audience here, we are humanized. So by that I mean we are in touch with actually the people who are potentially going to use the results. We would like to use the results of research, and then we actually start to become not just a scientist, but somebody who understands actually the softer aspects. And just a small example from my own personal experience. So I'm an engineer, and I went into the construction industry thinking about how to do energy efficient ventilation. But it was the architects that taught me way more about actually the challenge and how you go and do things, and the benefits of some of the things that potentially the ideas that we were generating had nothing to do with the benefits they were talking about, had nothing to do with energy efficiency, but rather more about actually just creating better environments for people. And then that was actually what really mattered, and the fact that we were able to do it for less energy was just, okay, well, therefore the answer is blindingly obvious. But it was actually the understanding the human aspects of an engineering solution, massively important. And members of the public are indeed individualized as well. So it's not just you're talking to the wider masses, but we're talking to groups of individuals, and that's really important. Trusting relationships are built. That is as a recipe, an ingredient of good public engagement. The needs of society are better understood. Decision making is supported, and there are two ways here that moral authority is bestowed. But more importantly for me, right, just because that I thought this was incredible. So moral authority, I can understand, well, I've now got the right, and I've got the trust of the public. No, what really takes my breath away is that where the public actually teach us, scientists, things that we didn't know. And that's where hidden knowledge about, you can't do this because of the context. And that's really powerful. So hidden decision-making being supported where actually hidden knowledge being uncovered. And then actually collective action happens, so good public engagement, where people actually then want to go and do something about it. And that might mean going and sort of getting active to say, right, well, we don't agree with this. Or it might be, actually, we want to support this and we're going to encourage it, or it might be we want to take it in a slightly new direction. So getting the public involved and actually so have collective action happening is really good. And having one's research direction refocused, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, right? You might think, I've done all of these years of effort and now I've got to go and change. No. The worst thing is to continue going down a route that's going to go and not make a difference to society. The best thing is actually, where your research actually does have an impact on society, and that's going to be most likely when you've engaged early, potentially through co-production, so you didn't need to change direction. But if you haven't done, and you decide that we're going to have a change in direction, that's okay, all right? It's not quite as good as the first one, but it's better than just keep going, generating an idea because you want to get some academic papers out of it, all right, but aren't going to go and change the world. It depends on what your purpose and what your real reason for becoming a scientist. So why isn't more done in the field of public engagement? And the answers that we are postulating here, so again, this is just our sort of suggestions, is that research practitioners may not always have easy access to the latest public engagement approaches. And part of this is that the world of public engagement itself is so rich and complicated. It's so because there are lots of different ways of doing it, that it's actually created an academic area in and of itself, which then makes it a bit difficult if you're outside of that to be able to tap into it. So it's not a criticism, it's just this is actually because it's so complicated that actually is partly what's happening in certain areas of society. So one just needs to be mindful of that. Therefore, the people who are the public engagement experts do a fantastic job of not only thinking about and doing research as to figuring out the new ways and writing those in academic journals, but writing, because they're public engagement specialists, also writing things and communicating about how that actually matters. And that's where the non-public engagement specialist academics, all right, it's that wealth of material that's really important to get one's hands on. And so that's where, when I talk about easy access, if you're finding it sort of just a bit hard to read some of these things, it's not that there isn't good stuff out there, it's just for a slightly different audience, and we need to make sure that we're just providing the right materials. Market forces are paramount, and in university settings and independent independent research organisation settings as well. It's about the papers. You know, I heard somebody talking just before I came in about the ref and things like that. Well, you know, public engagement will form part of it, but papers, you know, which journals, you know, what's the ranking of the journals that you're actually publishing in. And that's where a lot of the emphasis is, and there isn't as much emphasis on engagement with the public. So one just needs to be cognizant of that, right? I'm not saying it's wrong, but just need to be cognizant of the fact that this does go on, and if we care about changing society, we need to not necessarily just be constrained by some systems that are imposed on us as a university when we're trying to apply for funding. So we have to try and be honest and say, what is it that we're really here for, and making sure that we've got enough resource allocated to, and that could be time, for example, on public engagement. And then the last thing is that on this slide, there's no single view of what good practice in public engagement actually looks like. And that's because it depends so much on the context. So what is good in one application isn't necessarily going to work in another. It might be your audience, it might be the products, it might be the particular environment that you're challenging. Is it regulation? Is it societal norms? It depends what you're trying to sort of overcome and work with. So you're going to be, work within these things. It might mean that you're going to change what you actually did, what you're going to propose as a solution in light of this. And furthermore, academic establishments, we're getting better at it. I've seen, in terms of just my working with various universities, academic establishments, though, with a few exceptions, do not routinely provide public engagement training. Some universities do, but not all universities. And then funders tend to say that promoting effective public engagement, they say it's a critical part of their expectation of research. But where is the money and the time that's going to be carved out and permitted as part of that particular exercise? So saying it and actually turning up with the goods and saying, right, we're going to fund this and give you the time and resource to do this is another thing. And we don't necessarily always see wonderful correlation with on that in the research grants that we might get. And it might not just be from the research councils, it could be research grants which you are potentially raising from industry as well. It's not just research councils. We've all got a responsibility for it. And then the last thing is that the public don't feel necessarily they have a social commitment to get involved, which is where once you've got people excited about and the importance of this, so it cannot just be a one-stop. We're going to do this at the end of the project, or it needs to be a continuous thing. That this is important for society, for life, and therefore it needs to be a continuous thing. So what's the RI doing in conjunction with Lloyd's Register Foundation? So we've been working on a project for just under a year now, and we are going to start recruiting members, because the project is called the International Public Engagement Network. It's funded by Lloyd's Register Foundation, and we're scoping out the creation of this network of organisations who are actively involved and interested in public engagement, but who bring different knowledge bases to this area. So it might be, and it will be, different countries where you've got different societal norms, but there'll be different types of organisation as well, so from different sectors. So these won't just be academic research organisations, or even just public engagement specialists. The idea is that we try and bring on different organisations. So the commercial sector has a lot to teach us in the world of public engagement. In fact, they're very good at it, because in the commercial arena, you don't go and develop a product normally, right, without going and talking to potential customers first. So actually, what is your need? This is one type of product development. It's not the only one. But understanding quote customers' needs. They're not a current customer that would like them to be one, for example. What are your needs? And then involving them with focus groups to say, look, well, have you thought about these sorts of solutions? So they've actually got a lot to teach scientists about public engagement as well. That's just one example. But bringing different sectors together to learn from each other is incredibly important. And the International Public Engagement Network will focus the intention right now is an increasing the use of co-production or broader citizen engagement. So not just being a disseminate news and disseminate information, but exploring and trying out this co-production method. As I said earlier on, the Royal Institution, that isn't one of the core things that we do. We're a supporter of it. So we will be one of the organisations, but we will be drawing on the expertise of others who are experts at this, because we think it's important. And the clarity of purpose is critical. So if we just look at this, this slide is just to try and illuminate the differences between deliberative citizens forums and co-production. So when I first started, I thought, well, they sound rather similar. Actually, the nuanced differences are actually rather interesting and important. So a citizens forum, it's typically where you're looking at a single yes/no question, and it's accompanied by a set of moral value statements. Do you believe this? Is this important to you? So yes/no on each of these. It's the time scale over which this forum is held is time limited. It might be a week, it might be 6 weeks, or something like that. But it's a time limited fashion, and the participants don't know each other. The participants are diverse, and they're representative of the community in which we are trying to engage and learn from. And the success factors of citizens forums, therefore deliberative citizens forums, are things like advocacy, it being a disciplined process, and having open conversations. Co-production is rather different. Co-production is a much deeper, longer timescale involvement with the community. So the community is involved in even setting the question. So what's important to that community. So we're not just going to go and say we want to understand this particular issue. Actually, what issues matter to you? So getting the community to set it and directing the research. So that's the first thing. It's a fairly variable timescale, but the upshot is it's usually over a much longer timescale, 6 weeks. It can be many years, depending on the nature of the issues being tackled. So, for example, the decommissioning of a nuclear power station. This doesn't take a few weeks. This can take years, and therefore involving the local community in figuring out what's the answer that they would really like once the power station has been decommissioned. What's important to that community? Is it the aesthetics? Is it jobs, for example? And therefore, over the next decade, when they're decommissioning it, for example, really understanding these and having the community involved. So the participants are typically drawn from the community, and the success factor is usually time and money, right? Have we achieved have we been able to, for example, decommission a power station where the community is now accepting that is the solution that they've chosen? And therefore, does it stay there, or is it actually taken down, for example, or is it turned into something else? All of these are important, but which of those solutions may have been determined, for example, by which one will guarantee us long-term employment in that particular area? Because we were working at the power station before it was decommissioned. We'd like to still live here, so maybe changing its use might be better than just actually taking it to a greenfield site. So it's wholly dependent on the community and what they wish, and therefore arriving at this is incredibly important. And these sorts of methods are now mainstream. So fairly recently, you've heard about Extinction Rebellion, and the MPs have now bowed to Extinction Rebellion demand as they send out invitations to 100 climate change citizens' assembly. So they're starting with a very big audience in terms of, and they're going to be selecting those. But these people will not know each other, and they'll be involved over in a sort of a time-focused way to try and address and tackle some of these issues. What are the solutions that society therefore would like to be considered in the development for tackling things like climate change? So what are the next steps for the International Public Engagement Network? Well, we're networking with possible members right now. My colleague Nick in the audience is leading the charge and contacting a whole range of different organisations. We will agree the final approach with Lloyd's Register Foundation, and then we will get recruiting. So, what is it that perhaps you might be able to do and take away from this evening? I would invite you to reflect on what you personally want from public engagement, irrespective of your career goals. So what is it that you would really like from that? How could good public engagement, I'm not going to be here saying, well, this is the right public engagement method for you, but how could good public engagement improve your own work? And what might that mean for your relationship with your supervisor or your professor or your head of department or your academic dean, in terms of how far in the organisation that you are? And what can you do tomorrow to address these points? So just points of reflection. And with that, I'd like to thank you and be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Thank you.